Hello, this HighByte Intelligence Hub training video covers templating. Templating is a technique that can be used to scale solutions. Templating can be applied to multiple configuration objects, including connection inputs, instances, and pipeline flow trigger stages. Today we'll cover static templating, dynamic templating, and passing parameters between Intelligence Hub configuration objects. Let's start with a template on a connection input. I'll use OBCUA, already connected to an OBCUA server. I'm going to go to inputs and browse. And what I'm going to be doing is looking at these motor tags. You can see some tags there. And I can see this, the path is the same. Most of the tags are the same. You did see that one test tag. I'm not going to worry about that. We're not going to use it. So this is conducive to templating. The tag names are the same. They're similar tags. The path is the same. So we're going to template on these motors. And that's what we'll use for the basis of our training. I'll rename this our training video. Let's take a look what this looks like. So when I read back for motor 03, and it includes an ID for motor 03, so that should make things easy to keep track of. I see that as a branch read. I have the system information. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to change my max branch depth. Read again. So we're going to work with this. But what I want to do is I want to template this so that I'm getting information for 4 motors. And I'm going to use um, static templating. So we can see currently in my test result, I can also go to my input and I'm going to use my basic demo OBCUA connection. And we can see that it's flat, same object. And let's start moving from here and seeing how things change. So I'm going to turn on static templating. There's some configuration objects here. I'm going to use a specific name here for my parameter. Use machine ID. And I'm going to have parameters for motor 01, motor 02, motor 03, and motor 04. Forgot my 3, I didn't have to edit that. I'll save that. Now what I want to do is I also want to name this, and I can use this dot notation to do that in curly brackets. So my template name is going to be curly bracket, this dot machine ID, the same as my parameter. And the this dot and the curly brackets are important syntax when templating. So we'll see that pattern throughout. But the most important thing is here, I have to template my identifier. So in this case, it's the tag path, and that's what's going to iterate through. So this is going to be substituted with the pattern that I've identified. So when this executes, we'll see that now it returns an array, and each motor a motor ID has been returned with the different values, and that's really what I was after, and that's the power of templating, whether it be static or dynamic. In this case, static templating, that I can substitute that value that I've parameterized there into that, in this case, the tag path, or whatever I'm substituting for, the identifier in Intelligence Hub. You can also see that a few key things here. In my reference panel, the icon has changed, so now I have an icon to indicate that this is templated, and now I can see that there's an array of values, and that's really what I was after. So I've successfully templated this connection input. Something else to point out that's important is the template view. So once templating is being used, this view is enabled, and you can see I have my 4 different named templates here. I'm using the same pattern and identifiers that I've defined, and you can see here it's been substituted right in my identifier string, and I can test this. So now I'm testing individually just for this motor 01 parameter, which happens to align with ID motor 01. So that's very helpful to test and to verify that things are in fact templated. So that's static templating. Let's move now to dynamic templating. And I'm going to go back to my connections, and we're going to look at SQL Server. So dynamic templating allows me to obtain that list of parameters from an external source. And you can imagine that that list might become complex. It might include dozens or hundreds of different parameters that I want to use to obtain a significant amount of data. And to do that, I might obtain data from an external source. In this case, I'm connected to a SQL server. I have a query and I can test, and you can see here that I'm getting an array of motor IDs, just like what we saw before. And that's going to be used as my list that I feed into that connection input. That's going to be my list of parameters. And you notice here I purposely, used that machine ID earlier. So this is important. So this has to be, this array has to have the same number of elements in my as I have, for each parameter that I'm using. And this, in this case, a column name for the table. This is going to become my parameter name. Now, of course, with the SQL query, I could name that with whatever I want with an as, but it is important to note that that does have to be identical. So let's go back to the OPC UA connection, where I'm connected, training, and now I'm going to change to a dynamic template, same template name, but that has to exist in that array that I'm pulling back, right? Input, I use my basic SQL, my basic demo SQL Server connection, and I'm going to pull that right into the reference, the entire array. And now when I save and test, again, I'm getting back that full list, and you can see that I'm passing the motor 01 ID that's coming from the SQL Server into the OPCUA tag path to get back these values. And if I look at the template view, it's identical because that's what's being stored in the database. The same thing that I typed in is now being obtained from the database. So that's really helpful. That's dynamic templating. And that's useful. I'll just switch back, just to static. I can have multiple parameters, and when I have another parameter, right, it has to have the same number of in the pattern, right? So that's not gonna like that, right? So it has to have the same number of parameters defined in the pattern for each named parameter set. Um, and here I could, of course, just duplicate that, and now it's happy. And then I'm not passing that parameter in, but I could pass that parameter in. And the same is true with a dynamic template. That SQL query could be pulling back, multiple values for each element in an array, and I could use those here in my parameterization. So that summarizes static and dynamic templating. Let's move on and see how this might be used in an instance. So I'm going to go to a model. I have one model that I'm going to use. We're not going to use all of the different attributes in this model, but it is important to note, even that the site and motor are required. So I got to make sure that I satisfy that. So let's create an instance. Let's call it training, and I'm just going to tag this with my basic demo tag so I can find it, and it keeps within this filter that I currently have applied. All right, so now with my motor, we're going to obtain that. I'm just going to put in a default value for the time being, and also for the site because they're required. All right, I got it. Now I've created my instance. Let's make sure it works. Okay, so let's start populating. So I'll go to my reference panel, my inputs. We'll use the basic demo OPCUA connection, and I can map this, just like I normally would, just to get started here. So I have amps. I'll just go to my outline view, get my motor ID. Let's be the ID, amps, speed, vibration, and error. Oops, missed. All right, so now I'm pulling back data, but that's just for one of the motors, one of the elements in that array. What I want to do is parameterize this with my dynamic template parameters. So I got my input here. I'm going to go to my basic demo SQL Server connection, pull in that same reference. We're going to name it with our machine ID. Still works. We haven't, and now what we have to do, see, it's actually not templated yet, right? It's just passing those parameters, but it's still all for motor 01, so that can be confusing. That's not what we want. We got to pass those parameters into these connection string, the connection references for the connection input. So what I'm going to do is use a syntax to do that. And what I'm doing is I'm saying this dot machine ID, which is coming from the SQL Server query on this configuration element, is being passed to the connection input, which happens to have the same parameter name machine ID. So machine motor 01 is being passed to the machine ID on the connection input. And we have to do that for each of these. Just copy it so I get those all the curly braces that I need at the end there. And this has to be an expression. If you notice, I'm changing that from a reference to an expression. There. All righty, so let's save and test and see what this looks like. So now we're getting machine 01, 02, 03. You can see it's also in the error message. So we're getting back different data, and I've properly passed these parameters. So that's a key syntax. I'm passing so we get the machine ID, parameter name, and value from the SQL Server query. I'm using it here in this instance, but also passing it to the connection input. And what's interesting is if I go back to my connection input, I can actually turn this off. Now this won't work anymore, but I'm passing this from the downstream configuration object. So therefore it's going to work because I'm getting that parameter value from this upstream configuration object. And that's really important to understand. So everything now is being defined here at the instance level. There's no duplicate definition. I'm referencing it once here at the instance level. So let's take a look here what happens if I pass this on to a pipeline. So I'm going to create a training pipeline. Select that same tag just so that I'm using my current filter. And I'm just going to I'll create an empty pipeline to start from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I have a flow input. My flow input is going to reference that instance. Poll every 5 seconds. I'll break up the array that's coming in. And then what we'll do is we'll just publish it to MQTT. I have a basic demo MQTT, call the topic training, and I think that was the ID. Alrighty. No payloads. I wonder if I have the ID wrong there. It is motor ID. So now we got our data. So that's helpful, but I'm not actually using templating here. So I'm just using the instance. That's not a bad thing, but I can also template on the pipeline. So I can turn on templating and get my input. Remember my SQL query that I'm using to get my parameters into my reference panel. I'm going to name it exactly the same way. I wouldn't have to name it actually. A default name would be provided, but it's fine. I'll just use this. And then I can pass that parameter to the instance, and then it will also get passed to the connection input. So if I refresh, and after 5 seconds, it'll publish again, and we'll get our values. But there's not really no proof that this is coming from the parameterization. So what I'll do is I'll go back to my instance. So let's make sure I save this first in my training, and I'm going to turn off the templating. So now I'm going to be guaranteed that these parameters are being passed from the pipeline. So the parameters are being passed from the pipeline to the instance. So these parameters that are being obtained here, the dynamic templating parameters, are being passed to the instance to the connection. So that's really powerful. So I'm defining my template parameters one time on the pipeline on the flow trigger stage. That covers templating, static templates, dynamic templates, and passing parameters between configuration objects. Thank you.